In my experience of teaching and mentoring this methodology in my career over the last 2 decades, it's kind of what I alluded to. You learn that things rarely go the way that you thought they were going to go. And I've watched a lot of teams struggle with the first two phases of that traditional approach of sorting and setting things in order. And for a long time, I couldn't really figure out why. And it bothered me that it was such a struggle. And it dawned on me a few years ago. I was reading a quote from Taiichi Ono, which is one of the founders of the Toyota production system. And he said, without standards, there can be no improvement.
Find your Ikigai at ikigaitribe.com.
This is episode 90 of the Ikigai Podcast, and Steve Beauchamp joins me today. And Steve joined me on episode 46, on which we talked about always improving, lessons from the samurai. And you're returning, Steve, to talk about business transformation with 5S. So it's good to have you back on the show.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me back. It's hard to believe it's been that many episodes since I was on the show, but it felt like it was just like yesterday when we were chatting about that other book. And so it's good to be back.
Good to have you back here in time. I mean, that's more than 2 years probably. So you're right. Time goes by quickly, but it feels like yesterday. And Steve, we have something to celebrate. You've written a leader's guide to optimize workplace organization, improve morale, and increase productivity with a book called 5S Mastery. So congratulations. This is your third book now.
Yeah, third full-length book. It's kind of crazy how I've just been getting into the practice of writing, and it's actually become a source of Ikigai for me to just be able to sit and write and unpack what I'm thinking. And sometimes I'll share those things with other people, and sometimes they just kind of get tucked away into the, recesses of the cloud. And I think it's just, it's been interesting to be able to experience that and allow it to help me communicate my thoughts. And it really it really is a source of Ikigai for me. And honestly, I would do it even if nobody read anything I wrote. So,
well, that's inspiring. I'm still writing, and it's a bit of a struggle. At times it feels like a source of Ikigai when I have those days where I feel, the words are flowing and I'm freely expressing myself.
Yeah.
And then other days I just can't seem to find the energy to write a sentence. So it's quite challenging, but I guess, it's this self-expression.
Yeah. And even I have those days too, to be honest. And I think the great part about the whole thing is that you have other sources of Ikigai, right? So if you're not feeling it, one thing you'd be like, yeah, I'm going to go over here and find something go out to nature and just spend some time walking in the trees or listening to birds sing or something like that. So yeah.
I agree totally. That's what Ken Moggy says is robust about Ikigai. If you have multiple sources, it doesn't matter if you're not feeling it from one. You can, go out in nature, enjoy a meal, catch up with a friend.
Totally. Yep.
So let's touch on your book. It opens with the questions. Do you find yourself drowning in clutter, wasting time, and feeling overwhelmed by disorganization in your business? Have you tried various solutions, but they just don't stick? And if I'm honest, sometimes I would be saying yes to those questions. So I'm guessing 5S is the answer to these questions. And in your book, you offer a new 5S approach, which we will explore in this episode. So it'll probably be wise to first talk about the traditional 5S model. So can you break down the 5S model and and what that is?
Yeah, sure. So I think maybe it's good to kind of go back in time a little bit to like post World War II Japan, back when, the country was recovering from, the devastation of what war brings. And there was, a group of folks working at a small little automotive manufacturer that you might have heard of called Toyota. And they had a few individuals that worked there that, really were prolific in how they thought about manufacturing. And one of the methodologies that they developed was what we now know as 5S. And so 5S is, it's not really a fancy kind of acronym. It's really just all the words start with the letter S. And so that's kind of where it came from. And it's really been the backbone in the manufacturing world for a long time, and probably sometime in the 1980s is when it really started, kind of spreading globally. So let's, maybe it'd be helpful to talk through like the traditional order of how 5S has been taught in the Western world. So it starts with the first S. And, for the sake of our listeners, maybe I'll break out both of the English and the Japanese at the same time. So the first one is sort, or siri. The second is set in order, or seiton. Then you have shine, which is seiso. And then you have standardize, seiketsu. And then finally, sustain, which is shitsuke. So, it's not an overly fancy or complicated kind of methodology. It's really about how to organize your workplace in a way that makes sense and really helps your workplace become just easier on the people, right? Mm-hmm. I think the traditional way that it's been taught in the West, and how I was originally taught too, is this idea of, well, you just, go through this in order. It's just like a step-by-step linear kind of path. Well, we just start with sorting and then we finish with sustain. And I think the thing that's challenging about that is it doesn't really take into account how life actually happens in the workplace, I think. And, it kind of makes you feel like, oh, there's this pressure to like get to the end. Right. Mm-hmm. Where it's like this kind of project kind of thinking. And I think that's traditionally how I was taught and how a lot of people think about it. And so, I think that's kind of like a great introduction to traditionally what it's been known as.
All right. So just to review, so we have sort, set in order, shine. And then after that, we have standardize, sustain, and there's this linear approach. And in your book, you offer an alternative, almost a cyclical approach. So what is your approach that you discuss in your book?
Yeah, so, in my experience of teaching and mentoring this methodology in my career over the last 2 decades, it's kind of what I alluded to. You learn that things rarely go the way that you thought they were going to go. And I've watched a lot of teams struggle with the first 2 phases of that traditional approach of sorting and setting things in order. And for a long time, I couldn't really figure out why. And it bothered me that it was such a struggle. And it dawned on me a few years ago, I was reading a quote from Taiichi Ohno, which is one of the founders of the Toyota production system. And he said, without standards, there can be no improvement. And around the same time, I had picked up a copy of Masaki Imai's book, Kaizen, The Key to Japan's Competitive Success. And in that book, he talks a lot about the connection between the improvement cycle, which is the plan, do, check, act, or action, and the standardization cycle, which is the standardized do, check, action, also known as like your daily routine, right? So the way those 2 things interact interact with each other. You have this daily, day-to-day grind, basically, if you will, of like, this is the work that we do on a day-to-day basis. And then periodically be like, we actually need to make some changes and improve how we're doing this day-to-day. So that's how those two things interact with each other. And, I started having this realization that there was an awful lot of conversation around standardization as really a foundation for improvement. And then I started asking the question, well, why is it that we wait until the fourth phase of 5S to talk about standards? And it's kind of got me going down this road of investigating and digging into a little bit more of the context. And, I think, kanji is a really fascinating thing to me. And you and I have talked about this a lot in the past, just in this conversation we've had, where it's just so much meaning can be found in just a few strokes of a brush. And that I find very fascinating. And, I'm also an avid learner. So I started digging into those kanji symbols that make up those 5S that I introduced a little bit ago. And I think it's important to understand original context of what things mean before you start applying it to yourself. And so I started digging into those and realized that, there was some things I think we were missing along the way in that interpretation. So that's kind of like how I got going down this road. And, but I think I'll just pause there for a second. And
So you've actually got a diagram in your book that maybe we'll include in the show notes that offers this cyclical approach. But I agree with you in terms of the power of studying kanji rather than just accepting, I guess, one person's best attempt to translate a concept or word. So when you do look at the kanji, it's almost like this epiphany. It's like, now I have a greater understanding of this concept, and it's can be used in various contexts, and it has this deeper meaning. So would you like to touch on some of these words where you've explored the kanji and you've obviously discovered it has more depth to the meaning?
Yeah. I don't know if you're like really paying attention a little bit ago, but you'll recognize that 4 of the S's all start with say, right? Which is like in the English language, we spell that SEI. And to an English speaking person, you might not really think anything of that because you're like, well, it's just the same thing. Because, typically in the English language that, is very, very much the same almost all the time. However, in the kanji, you can have something that sounds exactly the same, but is actually very different. And if you look at the kanji for these words, they actually have 2 of them, seiketsu and seiso. The first kanji, sei, in that one actually refers to purity and cleanliness. And the other 2, siri and seitan, have this idea of order. And so then I started unpacking this a little bit more and discovered that I think we had the order kind of mixed up. And I think we think about this in terms of like this linear fashion instead of this cyclical idea that I like to think about. So you have this idea of standardization at the core of what we do. And because, the full word seiketsu isn't just about this idea of purity and cleanliness. It's that idea that it's holding everything together, right? So that like what is uniquely, the thing that like holds this all, if you are missing one piece, it all kind of falls apart kind of idea. And so you're having that at the center, and then the cycle part of it includes that idea of what used to be referred to as this shine. I think that kind of loses a little bit of the meaning behind it. And so I like to use the word spotless instead
Spotless.
of shine, because it's beyond, this idea of just like cleaning something. It's the, how can you make this like as you know as pure as you can, but also be functional and efficient at the same time. And then thinking about this idea of the other two, Siri and Seitan, I discovered in doing some research that in most applications in Japan, these two words aren't necessarily done apart from each other. It's more of a simultaneous thing that's done as like, you do one, then you're doing the other, right? It's kind of like this, it's understood that that's how it's done. But when it was like explained, I think, and translated, maybe that was kind of lost.
Okay.
And so this idea of, creating order, using those two from chaos is really kind of the idea behind it. And then finally have the completing the circle is this idea of self-discipline, and rather than just sustain, because I think sustain doesn't really accurately describe what they're trying to communicate through what this word actually means. And so it's not just about sticking to a routine, it's about that continuous self-reflection and that effort to take action and improve things when you need. And so that's how I think about it in this cycle rather than this linear approach. And also, I think it puts a lot of pressure on people to think about, doing this as like a linear one and done kind of activity. So,
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that makes sense. I'm always looking for ways to improve my processes, and it's never linear. There's always for this podcast, there is this process that once it's recorded, I upload it, my team take care of it, they turn it into a blog post. Obviously, they upload the episode. And over the years, I've attempted to improve, the quality of both the audio, the summary, the images. So it never feels like there's a linear approach to it. I mean, maybe per episode there is, but the overall process of doing the podcast, it's cyclical because, I'm looking for a new guest and we repeat this process. But overall, I think we're always striving to improve each episode. So it's strange for me to think about this as essentially as a one-person business owner with two virtual assistants. And I was going to ask you, can we apply this to any type of business? But before I ask you that, what is the benefit of this new approach you're formulated?
Yeah, I think from my perspective, if you think about this more in a cyclical approach as opposed to a linear, like, project kind of style thinking, it takes a lot of pressure off of people, because then it becomes this, oh, okay, so this is just what we're doing. And our mindset is, if we think about how we could potentially improve upon this in the future, rather than saying we have to get this perfect and we have to get this right the first time, that puts a lot of pressure on people. So I think that's one thing that this different approach, I think, offers. And, it's very much like the idea of Kaizen, which what you were just talking about, this idea of continually wanting to improve upon where you are and where you're going, whether that's, in your personal life or in your business life, right? I think it's important to recognize that we're not static beings, right? Like, we don't exist in this like perfect equilibrium. Like, we're constantly changing and constantly evolving. And so, and it also really ties into the SDCA cycle very well, right? So this idea of standardization that feeds into the doing, or the, the spotless piece of keeping something like clean, and also then transitioning into the checking piece, which is the sorting, setting things in order, and then you have your action step, which is the self-discipline. And the thing that, really occurred to me in writing this too was, how could you possibly sort and set something in order if you don't know what the standard needs to
Mm.
be?
Yeah, there needs to be a benchmark to follow. Or
And further than that, why would you sort and set in order something that isn't clean? I mean, you wouldn't put your dirty dishes into the cupboards and then take them out and clean them afterwards, right? I mean, that seems kind of weird. So,
well, you never know. With my washing, my wife might tell me that's what I do. Anyway, but I totally agree. That's a good
yeah,
metaphor.
yeah,
Why would you check? Put something away that's dirty. So
right. And so it just, to me, it makes more sense to think about this from the context of, okay, well, let's set a standard, and then let's make sure that, things are starting out in this like clean fashion, and then we'll figure out how to sort and set things in order, and then we build that self-discipline to reflect and think about, is there any room for improvement, and if there is, do we need to go back and adjust our standard? And then continually just going back and over and over and over again through that cycle.
all right. So with this 5S approach, do you think I could apply it to my business? So what I do. I have a team of 2, myself. So what do you think?
Absolutely. I think any size business and honestly any type of business could benefit from this kind of methodology and approach. Because when you think about in your particular context, so you have a very virtual presence, right? Like everything is pretty much done electronically. Where are you storing all that electronic, matter? It's all being stored in the cloud. Well, if you think about how you store things in the cloud, just like thinking about the podcast as like one facet, right, of the business that you have, you certainly wouldn't want to just have a dumping ground where you just put things without any kind of way to know what's what, because it would take you a really long time to find it if you had to go search for it. Also, it may not be, just aesthetically pleasing to just have things just all over the place. So if you think about setting that standard of and taking the podcast episode as an example, right? You would have a standard for, this is how we find a guest. This is how we, do the recording, and this is how we do the mastering afterward, and so on and so on. And there's so many different facets to it that do apply no matter what context you find yourself in, whether it's virtual or physical. So yeah, and I actually talk about that in the book too. And I try to break it down in a way that no matter what type of business you find yourself in, whether that's a coffee shop or a bakery or a virtual presence or manufacturing, doesn't matter. Like these concepts are universal and they apply just pretty much across the board.
I can definitely see how it would apply to like file management. And if I'm not careful, my desktop can be a mess of, images, PDFs, video, audio, and this bad habit of I'll just download it to the desktop. If I do that 20 times
Yeah.
a day, after 5 days, I've got hundreds, 100 icons on my desktop. So
yeah, and you don't typically see those until you minimize everything, and you're like, "Whoa, what is going on here? This is kind of nuts." So yeah, I can totally relate to that.
And so that actually might relate to a word of which your book reminded me of, which is the Japanese word muda. So what is muda?
Yeah, so if you think about like a definition, you could think about it in terms of like uselessness or pointless. Often in the business context, it's referred to as waste, right? So these things that are not necessary, no matter what those happen to be, whether it's adding more time to accomplish a task, whether it's like physically having to move around things to get somewhere, you can think about it in this context. Imagine you need to get to your desk in your office and you have all these boxes in the way. And so you either have to walk around them, crawl over top of them, or move them just to be able to get to your desk. Well, that's just, an example of waste, an example of muda.
Mm.
So it's basically preventing you from, being able to accomplish really what is necessary that, the customer is willing to pay you for.
Yeah. Yeah, this was helpful because I always associate the word just to waste, but I learned from your book, it's obviously something that impedes process.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
It's a waste of time and energy. So that's something to think about. How are you creating muda? Going back to file management, that does get to a point where I've got to stop and organize and delete files and find their appropriate places, and that can take a long time to solve.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's really 7, different types of muda traditionally. There's
really?
a bunch of different schools of thought on how many there actually are. But I'm more of a purist, I guess. So I'm kind of like stuck on the 7. But there's this idea, and it forms a acronym. So if you want to think about a way to remember it, it's the individual's name is Tim Wood, right? So you have transportation, inventory, motion, waiting, overproduction, overprocessing, and defects. And so anytime you have any form of muda in your process that falls into one of those 7 categories, it's really taking away from you being able to produce what your customer really wants. And typically not something your customer is willing to pay you for, right? Like they're not willing to pay for your defects, right? I mean, let's be honest, nobody likes things that are broken or quality defect, right? So that's kind of like and I unpack muda a little bit in my book as well, for those that want to dig in a little bit more on that.
Yeah, I mean, I know Japan's very big on, not selling anything with the slightest defect that perhaps the average person wouldn't even notice. So their quality control is something they really associate to customer experience. And
yeah.
I think I've watched videos of guitar makers, and once the guitar's put together, if there's the slightest bump or scratch on the neck or the body, it's like, we can't sell this one. And it's like, wow, I'd buy it. So
yeah. It's definitely it's interesting because there's like that, flip side to that perfection too, where there's like beauty in the imperfection. And so I think it's really fascinating how there's like those 2 diametrically opposed ideas that coexist in the Japanese culture. And I think that's really, fascinating to me as well. But yeah.
There you go. Yes. I mean, I remember even when I used to help Amazon sellers sell on Amazon Japan, and I remember telling these sellers, your packaging has to be as almost as good as your product, and it's got to be strong and sturdy, and it can't be made from flimsy paper or cardboard, because if it arrives with a dent or it's slightly creased or squashed, you're going to get complaints on just the packaging. Whereas in the West, we probably wouldn't worry about that too much. So a lot of thought goes into, I guess, all of these processes to create a service or product where it's, standardized to this high level. And I guess associated to that and to the elimination of muda would be, leadership.
Yeah.
So would you like to touch on the role of leadership in 5S implementation?
Yeah, I think, and honestly, like this, I think goes, in my opinion, for everything in a business. But I think without any kind of leadership, continuous improvement efforts are going to fail.
Yeah.
right? And I think that's true of any kind of initiative in a business. You can't just tell people to go do something and then expect it to come out exactly the way you want it to. I think you need to set that example, right, for the team to be able to follow. And, I think when there's that failure to do so, that's where you end up seeing those instances of, oh no, just do as I say, don't do as I do. Right. And that just creates this like, well, what the hell? Like, why, why would I be okay being on a team, working for a leader that doesn't actually practice the things that they're asking their team to do. And I think it kind of follows the whole spectrum of like setting vision and allocating appropriate resources to be able to accomplish tasks that you're asking the team to do. And that can be a bunch of different things in terms of resource. It's like being present and being a part of like developing policy and procedure for the team to be able to know what is the standard that we're working towards. And, really being there to then remove those barriers that's preventing them from getting there. And, really showing accountability and celebrating also with the team. I think that's something that in the West we're terrible at. I don't think we celebrate success nearly as much as we should. I think there's this focus on doing more all the time. and I don't think we stop and recognize how far we've come, and like taking a moment to just celebrate that, I think is really important. And as a leader, if you're not doing that, chances are your team isn't going to either, right?
Yeah.
Like it's not something you could expect your team to do without you setting that example for them. So I think, when it comes to that leadership role, I think that's for me really where it kind of comes into play.
One would think celebration and that communication of process success would be crucial to employee well-being. Like you want your employees to feel what they do is valued and that this is shared success and it's worth working here. Like we appreciate what you do, so we celebrate our wins. So that kind of points to the human element that you wrote about of 5S. So can you touch on that too, the human element in 5S?
Yeah, thanks for asking. I think it's interesting to me how often we look at our processes and our businesses and we think, oh man, it's just, people aren't working hard enough or they're not doing the right things. And I don't know why they're not doing the right things. And there has to be this respect for the people that are doing the work. And you have to recognize exactly what you're saying. Like if you're not stopping and celebrating and appreciating the people that are part of the team that are doing the work, chances are you're going to have a lot of turnover in your business because people aren't going to want to stay somewhere where they're not being appreciated for the work they're doing. And I think it's important to, also show that, you're part of that team, like as the leader, like showing that, hey, you actually care about the people that are doing the work. And often, people end up just becoming victims of their process and they are doing things not because they're trying to be malicious and they're trying to have like bad intent. I think it's just their hands are tied sometimes and they end up having to do the things that the process is like dictating that they do. And I think, taking time to show respect for people, building those standards so that people understand the expectation of, what do you actually need me to do here? Right. I think if I reflect on my career, the times where my leaders were very clear about what they needed from me, I think made my life a whole lot smoother in that role, So I think that's where the human connection piece comes in. You have to recognize that these are people; these aren't like robots, right? And no matter how much AI, is like rising up in the world, I think you're always going to need people, and so it's important to recognize them and stay connected to them. So
I totally agree, and I think in this age now where we can outsource a lot of our work, we often don't get to know the people doing our work, and we don't treat them as one of our team. It's like you're just an outsourced worker, or we'll get it done at the cheapest possible price. So yeah, even in my business, I try to be aware of that, and I really like you have a really good team of two, and I celebrate the wins and I include them in some of my decisions. I ask for their perspective, and it's really brought us together, and they've been long-term employees now. So I think the human element matters, and I think you see them as people first before employees.
yeah.
So with all of this in mind, a practical approach or practicality is obviously really important. So how can we implement 5S into our business?
But I think, it's important to internalize that quote that I shared earlier from Taiichi Ono, right? Where without standards, there can be no improvement. And I think if we recognize that, as if you find yourself as a leader in whatever capacity in your business and what you're being asked to be responsible for, I think it's your responsibility to understand, like, what does that standard need to look like? And that's your starting point, right? So figure out what that standard needs to be, and then figure out, okay, well, then what process do we need to produce this standard that we're expecting? And everything starts to flow from there, right? So you can measure your success along that trajectory in a bunch of different ways. Like I don't even know how many different kinds of variables you could think of to measure, but there's plenty out there, right? And but if you don't start with a standard, everything else is meaningless. Like, you could be measuring the completely wrong things,
Yeah.
and not actually achieving the standard that you're actually wanting to achieve. And so, you then, from there, it flows into that definition of, like, okay, well, what's necessary in order for us to produce this thing? And, you flow through of, like, those expectations we talked about, setting vision, documenting how things should flow, and how that process needs to behave, so that you can then build training from those documents so that people are being trained in a consistent way. And then lastly is when you leverage technology. I think we've become very lazy in how we do business these days, where we try to leverage technology first. I think if you don't understand what your process is and you try to leverage technology, or maybe your process isn't awesome and it's creating a lot of defects and you leverage technology, what ends up happening is you end up automating a really bad process. And so I don't think that's a really great idea or approach. So get clear on the standard and the process first, and then allow that technology to, really take you to the next level, because then you'll have this ability to make the process easier on the people, right? Which then is creating that, additional touch point of, like, that human element piece.
Yeah, this really makes sense, especially when I read one of your subtitles of defining what's necessary. And if you get that wrong, I guess everything after that isn't going to really help your business. It will turn to muda, maybe.
Yeah, there's a pretty good chance that's going to happen. Yeah. And then you're going to call somebody like me to come and help you sort it out.
Yeah, so that's something I'm going to try to be more aware of. Like, okay, what's necessary here? What's the vision? What are my expectations? But yeah, what am I defining here? So I can see I could apply this approach to my business. And yeah, as you said, there's all this talk about leveraging technology, especially with AI now. But before you jump on that, I've been quite slow with the uptake of that because I do have pretty good systems, I think. Yeah, I'm quite cautious to dive into what everyone's talking about just because everyone's saying, "Oh, it's going to change your business and you'll get everything done quickly." And so, yeah, this process I think is very helpful. And all these things was like, oh yeah, I document processes, and when required, I've even offered training to my team. I take training, and yeah, we have standard operating procedures. So I guess that's relatable to consistency checks. So I can definitely see how I could apply this to my business. And one crucial aspect, and maybe related to defining what's necessary, is a Japanese word you write about called hansei. So what is hansei?
So Hansei is a very critical part of that self-discipline phase that I talk about, and it's a self-reflective practice that's really encouraging you to change your life. But it's not just about asking simple questions and having simple answers, right? It's about thinking about these questions from the perspective of change. And like, in order for you to come to grips with the idea of wanting to change something in your life, like, you have to admit that there's a gap, right? So you have to understand that, okay, I'm here, but I want to be way over here. Like, okay, well, now we have this gap that you can be emotionally connected to, of like, okay, I need to close this gap and get closer to where I want to be. And, if you're not connected to the gap, or the fact that there is a gap in the first place, you're not going to be invested in like actually getting there. And so it's really about it's a very deep, meaningful conversation you're having with yourself. It's not just this like, oh yeah, I need to like lose a few pounds or something. It's not it's not that simple, right? It's like it's much, much deeper, like digging into that. And so, I write about the 5 questions that I've found to be really helpful in developing that kind of practice for yourself.
Yep.
And it starts with, and by the way, I recommend that, as a leader, you kind of go through these questions like at least once a week with
All right.
yourself. And
Let's take a
so,
look at them.
yeah, typically at the end of the week is when I do this. So I'll sit down and I'll say to myself, okay, well, what did I say I was going to do that I didn't do? And if you want to do this on a daily basis, you would do this reflection at the end of each day, and you could just be like, well, what did I say I was going to do today that I didn't do?
Mm-hmm.
And be honest with yourself, right? Because sometimes we can gloss over that, but then the next one kind of like hits me pretty hard. Sometimes it's like, what am I proud of that I did today? Right? Because you think about the contrast between those two is like really important, I think, because then you can get real with yourself, and then you can ask yourself that question of, well, how did I lead the people that were around me, and how did I follow? Because I don't think you can truly lead unless you know how to follow. And then finally, like, looking to tomorrow based on what I learned today, what will I do differently?
Mm.
And really, applying in real time that like improvement cycle for yourself of like, okay, how can I do tomorrow differently than I did today? And recognize that it's a process, right? It's not a one and done kind of thing. It is, just like how a process operates, it never stays static, right? a process left unattended is going to shift and drift all over the place.
Mm-hmm.
And I think our personal lives and how we show up for others is very much like that. I think it's there needs to be intention behind it. So
I agree. And to reflect on these questions now, what am I proud of that I did today? So I'm proud that I had you on, Steve.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. And looking to tomorrow, based on what I've learned today, what will I do differently? Well, I might ask myself these questions and look at implementing 5S into my business. So, yeah, I've definitely learned a lot. There's a lot here to, I guess, unpack and look into. So if our listeners want to do that, they could purchase your book, Survive-S Mastery, a step-by-step leader's guide to optimize workplace organization, improve morale, and increase productivity. Where can people purchase your book, Steve?
Yeah, so August 30th, which is a few days away from when we're recording this, is when it'll be available. It'll be available as paperback, as a hardcover, or an ebook. And if you just search in the search bar in Amazon, you'll be able to find it just by searching 5S Mastery. It'll show up pretty quickly. So
awesome. Well,
yeah.
Congratulations. You've given me some motivation. I'm halfway through a book and I need to, get on to finishing that. So thanks again for coming on to the podcast. And finally, where can people reach out to you?
Yeah, I think there's two ways. Probably the easiest way is through LinkedIn. And you can find a link to my profile on the Ikigai Tribe website in the coach's profile. And you could also email me directly, steve@stevebeauchamp.com. And I read all my email. So it's not being read by some random outsourced person. I read all and respond to all my emails. So if you want to reach out to me there, you can do that as well. So
awesome. Well, thank you again, Steve, for joining me. And we will have you back perhaps when you write your fourth book. Is there another book in the works?
There is actually. I haven't fully decided which direction I'm going to go, but I'm in the process of thinking that through. It'll be one that's closely connected to this book that I just finished. My first two books were very much connected to each other. This next book is a very different kind of direction that I went with this book, and the fourth book will be very much connected to this one. I just haven't fully baked it out just yet, but it's in the works for sure.
All right. Well, I look forward to hearing about that. And hopefully, who knows, maybe one day we'll do a book launch or something together.
That'd be cool. Yeah, we should totally do that. Yeah, for sure.
All right, buddy. Good to chat with you and speak to you soon.
Yeah, right on. Thanks for having me on the show. Appreciate it.
My pleasure, Steve.
This episode was brought to you by the Find Your Ikigai course. Developed in consultation with Japan's leading Ikigai researchers, the Find Your Ikigai course is the only culturally accurate and evidence-based practical guide to the Ikigai concept. To learn more about the Find Your Ikigai course, please visit ikigaitribe.com.